Hello and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Planet Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with Food for You and the Planet. Today's episode features Ryan Zinn, Regenerative Projects Manager at Dr. Bronner's. Ryan focuses on Dr. Bronner's international supply chains and farmer training. He has worked in the food and farm justice movement at home and abroad for 20 years, including with such organizations as the Center for International Law, Friends of the Earth-Paraguay, Global Exchange, and the Organic Consumers Association. Thanks for being here today, Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me, Rosemary. I'm super excited.
So what is Dr. Bronner's and what types of products does it create?
Oh, that is a great question. So Dr. Bronner's is a family soap company. We actually just completed, I think, our 77th or 78th anniversary here in the United States. And it was actually founded by Emanuel Bronner, who himself was a third-generation German-Jewish soap maker. He ended up fleeing Germany during the 1930s at the onset of World War II and lost a fair amount of his family in the Holocaust. And as he came into the United States, he thought he wanted to spread this vision of what he called all one. And he went around the United States, landing in California, talking about uniting all of spaceship Earth and uniting all people under kind of this all one ethos. And he'd actually hand out soap at different places and, kind of preaches his message. And what he found was people just came for the soap and then took off and didn't listen to his whole spiel. So he ended up putting much of his philosophy on our bottles, which became that kind of iconic Dr. Bronner, the label that many people might be familiar with. And then over time, it was actually his grandchildren, his grandsons, Mike and David Bronner, who took over the company. And they were really visionary insofar as that they wanted to really commit to make sure that Dr. Bronner's sourcing all of our raw materials that go into our soaps really comes from clean and ethical sources. And so that led us down this journey about 20 years ago to basically set up our own organic, fair trade, and regenerative certified supply chains all over the world to be able to supply the ingredients we need to make soaps. We also do another product like things like lotion, for example, and even some food products like chocolate and virgin coconut oil.
Yeah, I've tried the chocolate recently and it is very good.
Oh, great. It's good to know.
How did you become interested in a career in sustainable agriculture and food systems?
Oh, that is a good question. It was a little circuitous. I studied political science in college and wanted to get some sort of experience on the ground. And so I actually headed to South America to do surveys, interviewing families and mostly farming communities about the displacement from large mega projects. So things like these mega hydroelectric dams that we see scattered all over the world. In theory, they look great because we think they're kind of clean energy. But in reality, what we see oftentimes is that when the dams are built, they actually displace, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So I got my feet wet back in the, late 90s, just basically interacting more with farming communities and getting a better sense of some of their challenges. And so a lot of times that's access to the market, fair pricing, access to land. Certainly gender plays a big role in rural politics as well. And so that really just kind of opened up the doors for me. And so from Paraguay, I went to southern Mexico right as about 1999 when the fair trade movement really started to take off, especially in coffee. At that point, the coffee world, the coffee market was in a massive crisis. Farmers were losing their land, migrating to the United States. And I really began to dig into, rural economics and trying to understand, like, how do we solve for some of these problems? So after spending, 4 years working in rural communities in Latin America, I returned to the States to work on more policy aspects and made up with the Bronner's family, right, as the National Organic Program was kicking off in the United States. And a number of years later, I actually joined the company to be able to support with all of our farmer accompaniment and economic development for farmer suppliers all around the world.
What inspired the Dr. Bronner's team to look more closely at how the raw materials in their products are being produced? Why was that important to them?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I didn't really appreciate before I joined Dr. Bronner's, but is pretty standard across the industry, is that most companies, consumer packaged companies, they often have to work with brokers and intermediaries to be able to source all of their ingredients. And this is common, and really nothing against brokers. Like, that's their job. They play a very important role in facilitating the trade of raw materials every day. But the reality is even if you were to buy a certified organic ingredient, you don't have a whole lot of insight as to the reality on the ground. Was that farmer paid fairly? Was the farm worker treated fairly? Did they receive a living wage? Are they working under safe conditions? And similarly, we also were concerned not only with what happened at what we call the farm gate or on the farm with farmers and farm workers, but really what's happening throughout the supply chain. Oftentimes you may have a fair trade product, right? But that was actually processed and produced in a factory under not very fair trade conditions. So Dr. Bronner's basically kind of created this challenge, for our team, which was to really create and develop supply chains all over the world that actually met our values. And so that meant that it had to be organic certified as a jumping off point. That's very important. Consumers certainly want that. And it allows for farmers to receive an organic premium. So that's a very important first step as we look at transitioning rural economies from really this extractive industrial model to something that's a little bit more holistic and regenerative. From there, we really began to focus on fair trade. This allowed us to sort of work within a framework that supported farmers across the board. And what's really important to us, I think, farmers receiving a fair price for their product is pretty uncommon. As you know, working with farmers, that supply, in farmers markets. And so we want to ensure that our ethics and our values are reflected in our products. So we started first with organic certification, quickly added fair trade onto that. And now we're actually sourcing from about 10,000 small scale farmers all over the world that basically are certified organic, fair trade, and most recently Regenerative Organic Certified.
Wow, that's amazing. 10,000 farmers. That's incredible. So what does that work actually look like? Like, how do you work to create those socially and environmentally sustainable supply chains?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we often overlook is that there's a lot of great farmers doing amazing things. They're actually producing organically. They are, great members of their community and work in collaboration with their neighbors. But one of the big challenges is market access and value addition. So they may be able to produce a number of great things, but holy cow, is it tough to sort of manage the logistics, process of those products so they're in a form that consumers want or they can be preserved. And so what we noticed was one of the big bottlenecks to making sure that we don't kind of engage in this extractive model of agriculture was it's really investing in what we call primary processing. So it's that first step after we buy things from farmers that can process it to then ship to make a new product like soap, for example. So we've done this in a number of different places, starting first in Sri Lanka, where we were the first to have an organic and fair trade coconut oil mill, which allowed farmers to be able to sell their coconuts at a fair price. We actually employed people to turn that into milk, oil, and coconut chips or cream. And then we sent it to Dr. Bronner's or their companies. And really, that is really the most critical sort of first step. The other aspect really is to support farmers to either organize as a group or to work with pre-existing organizations and associations like cooperatives to be able to facilitate organic certification, for example. So it's really expensive for an individual farmer if they only have an acre or two of land to be able to organic certify. But what we did was then supported them through what we call group certification, which allows us to support the entire group certification, which means we actually have greater integrity, because if one person is not following the organic rules, for example, then the entire group loses out on their certification. So that allows for us to create basically enough critical mass of product to justify the investment, And then it allows for farmers to have a premium while we're able to then produce that and send that team to the United States to Dr. Bronner's or other buyers. So for our team, basically what we do is what I like to call wraparound services. We support farmers with certification issues for sure. We provide training, but other aspects that are often overlooked, things like financing, for example, logistics are really critically important. And then based upon our fair trade framework, we pay an additional premium on all product that is sold to Dr. Bronner's that goes into a community fair trade development fund. And then communities are able to basically decide what type of projects they want to do. That could be education, healthcare, or it could be things that really support economic development. So some farmers choose to then replant their fields, for example, maybe invest in a compost operation like we have in India. So it really runs the gamut. But the idea is that it is a democratic process using different stakeholders, and that includes farmers, farm workers, and factory workers to then have a better idea really what is the biggest priorities in the communities and how we can best support that.
Now, you mentioned that you source organic coconut. What are some of the other raw materials you source for your products, and where are they sourced from?
Yeah. So really for Dr. Bronner's, for our team, handles that sourcing and that farmer relationship. We actually have it pretty good. There's other companies that they deal with, dozens, if not hundreds of ingredients, and that's really tough. In our particular case, we just work with a handful of ingredients for our soaps, and that's primarily coconut oil, which makes up the bulk of it. We also do some palm oil, olive oil, and mint oil. Those are our top four really raw materials. And there's like a coconut belt that really runs through the tropics, and so we work primarily in Sri Lanka and Samoa, where we have sister companies, and then we actually source from other close third-party suppliers in the Philippines and other places, but all within the same framework of organic, fair trade, and Regenerative Organic Certified. And then we were able to actually establish the first ever organic and fair trade palm oil operation in Ghana. And many of your listeners may be familiar with palm oil and think it's really this very controversial crop. And in fact, in many cases, particularly in Southeast Asia and others, it's really devastating, right? Industrial palm oil is probably one of the worst things for the planet, in large part because it requires that you really clear cut primary forest, and the working conditions are pretty brutal. But in our particular case, we were working with small scale farmers and really the center of origin for palm oil. And that allowed us to be able to sort of build on the sort of foundation that farmers have been doing for many, many generations. And then by focusing on organic practices and fair trade certification, we were really able to round out a package that really made sense for farmers. And so in the case of Ghana, we work with some 800 farmers that supply the palm oil that goes into our soaps. And just one more thing to add when it comes to palm oil, I know it's a real dirty word for a lot of consumers, and rightly so. But when grown properly, you can actually produce 10 times the amount of oil using palm oil than you can compared to like other oil seeds, for example. So we actually see it as kind of like the best case scenario when actually done organically and fairly. But certainly I would not recommend industrial palm oil to anybody. And then lastly, there's two other projects that really kind of make up the bulk of our raw materials. One is in India. They produce our essential oils for mint. Our most iconic, fragrance is mint soap, and so we work with upwards of about 3,000 farmers that really operate on very small pieces of land. There, sometimes less than an acre. So that means that farmers have to get the most value out of their land as possible. So we've been supporting farmers there now going on 15 plus years. And there's a great opportunity to be able to support farmers to be able to grow organically and regeneratively, because in this place where we operate in Uttar Pradesh, they actually have some really great growing conditions, which is very different from other parts in the world. They can actually get 3 harvests of 3 crops a year, sometimes more. So that means that we're able to support farmers grow organically, not just for what we want, which is the mint oil, but for other crops as well. Everything from staples like rice to wheat, but other things like medicinal plants like tulsi and ashwagandha. So this allows us to really have a bigger impact beyond what we actually buy as a company. But it's also annual agriculture, right? It means they have to then harvest and replant. And this is where some of the biggest challenges we see in agriculture. Every time you disturb soil, that really increases the likelihood that you're going to be losing carbon to the atmosphere. and then topsoil to things like erosion. So what we've done is really support farmers and implementing regenerative organic practices to really stabilize and build up soil, so that not only can we sort of improve and maintain their yield, but really have kind of an investment for many generations. So that is mint oil in India. And then lastly, olive oil has long been an ingredient in soap for many thousands of years, in fact. And so what we did was focus primarily on partnering with farmers in Palestine and the West Bank, and then Israeli farmers in Israel. And the idea was to provide sort of a very symbolic, blending of the oils as our kind of like vote for peace in the region. And we've been working with farmers in Palestine since 2016. And this fair trade project at Canaan Fair Trade has been a really good vehicle to talk about economic development as a way to really anchor farmers on ancestral land, as a way to sort of fend off some of the divisions that we're seeing in the Middle East at this point. So those have been really the key four ingredients that we focus on, but nonetheless, we do work with a number of other ingredients as well. And we provide that same sort of support and accompaniment to all of those farmer groups.
How do certification programs such as USDA Certified Organic, Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil Certified, Regenerative Organic Certified, and Fair Trade help people and businesses understand how products are created? You touched on how you use some of those certifications with the products that you source. So I'd love to hear, why you think it's important to support those certification schemes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you had 12 hours, we can talk about the history of certification and all the good, bad, and ugly. But yeah, so we really started first with organic certification. The National Organic Program really kind of came about because before 2000, there were basically dozens of organic standards. So everything from like private standards to some states like California and Washington had their own standards, and everything in between. And so it was confusing for consumers and really challenging for retailers and manufacturers to figure out how do we really scale out organic and provide it to more people. And so Congress signed the Organic Foods Production Act, I think in 1992, and it took a fair while for them to figure out what that was going to look like. But in short, this is a federal program. It's an actual law that establishes practices and procedures for certifying organic foods. So the way that really works is that you have a national law in the United States, and then the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, then accredits different certifiers to be able to certify to that standard. So we work with a number of organic certifiers, and this allows us to channel an existing field that consumers can recognize, and then basically provide some assurance as to the practices. So in large part, it really depends crop by crop. The standard itself is quite extensive, but in our particular case, what we found was most of the time, both in terms of what consumers think of as well as what farmers think of, organic is basically not like spraying pesticides or applying synthetic fertilizers, all of which is great. And you can certainly do that and reduce the risk of exposure to consumers and farmers and farm workers, of which we support. But the real kind of like spirit organic really focused on building up soil health. And that was one thing that we really wanted to support and work on. So the nice thing about organic certification is that it is legally backed. So there's actually ways that you can sort of like have more accountability and transparency into the process. And if you really want to get into it, there's a whole process that reviews the standard, makes recommendations, the National Organic Standards Board, and all of those meetings are public. And then there are a number of other what we call private standards that have been built upon a similar process, which is basically consumer demand as well as that of farmers and producers as well. And I would say probably the most relevant for us is fair trade. As you know, and we've discussed, farmers just oftentimes don't make the money that reflects the cost of production. So when farmers work on their field, they actually harvest and prepare to sell. Oftentimes they're selling at a loss, and you're wondering, well, why the heck would anybody want to do that? And the big question is like, how do we support farmers to ensure that they have fair payment so that they can actually reinvest into their business, but also just have what we call a living income. And so that has really been a core part of what we've done. The fair trade movement really started, after World War II, and the idea was to provide a pathway for people that lived in devastated parts of Europe to be able to sell things at a fair price and redevelop their communities. Over time, it really changed, in large part because of, I would say, solidarity activists both in Europe and the United States looking for ways to support farmers. And this is the most common one, was really coffee. And so that really kind of emerged in this idea of how do we, support farmers, despite the fact that they've received, really historically low prices for commodity crops. And so coffee, I think, is probably the most, popular and most common one. But over time, different organizations have emerged to be able to certify to different fair trade standards to ensure that basically a couple of key principles here: fair prices for sure, long-term relationships, which is really, really critical for farmers to be able to sort of justify the investment and continue to work on their fields. But also the other aspect, which is important, which is this Fair Trade Development Fund, which means that buyers pay an additional percentage on top of the fair price to ensure that communities can then develop, as they see most fit. And then lastly, and probably the kind of like newest and maybe more interesting one, is this idea of regenerative. This concept really emerged in 2015 when the Rodale Institute, this very famous organization out of Pennsylvania, published a white paper that focused on the role that agriculture plays in climate change. And it was a great and very groundbreaking paper, in large part because it really opened everybody's eyes to the role that agriculture plays in climate change. And so oftentimes when we think about climate change, we think about smokestacks and pollution from cars, for example, or solar panels. But the reality is that industrial agriculture contributes about up to 1/3 of all greenhouse gases every year on a global scale. And so we have this tremendous opportunity when we focus on regenerative practices that really build up soil health to not only reduce emissions from agriculture, but actually to sequester atmospheric carbon and put it back into the soil where it belongs. And so this is a huge opportunity for us to really focus on those practices that not only reduce emissions, but build up soil health and can have these sort of co-benefits like things like improving nutrient density, and making crops and farms much more resilient in the face of climate change. So in 2015, Dr. Bronner's Patagonia and the Rodale Institute kicked off this process where we wanted to figure out a way to avoid greenwashing of the regenerative concept. Like sustainability is oftentimes greenwashed because it's not backed by a true standard or definition. And we wanted to make sure that it built upon organic certification, just because we've had this long legacy and all this work that's gone into organic certification. But there's been a couple of loopholes that we wanted to close, mostly as it relates to soil health, but also fair trade and animal welfare. So in 1999, we actually started the first pilot projects for the Regenerative Organic Certified process, of which Dr. Bronner's had 4 of the 20. And then since then, it was a little bit challenging during COVID. Nobody was doing audits for many places in the world. But since then, we've actually grown quite a bit. And so now there's hundreds of thousands of acres of regenerative organic certified land all over the world. And I think the listing of their products is really, really growing. And it's great to see retailers actually highlight these products as well. So we're pretty enthusiastic about that. So that's kind of a very fast overview of the certification, world from at least our perspective.
What do you think companies can do to try to source more products that are made using certified ingredients? Like, how do consumer goods manufacturers try to incorporate more certified raw ingredients into their supply chains? And what can customers do to try to make sure the products they're buying are certified?
Indeed, that's a great question. It's really challenging for a lot of companies to be able to make this investment, not only in staffing like Dr. Bronner's has to be able to do a lot of this work, but really to navigate a very complicated landscape. Holy cow, is it difficult? So I think in large part, I would say start really slow and figure out what are some of those supply chains or ingredients or crops that would either be considered high risk, things like cocoa, for example, or palm, where we have a legacy of forced labor, low prices, and environmental destruction, or those areas that have like high potential. In our particular case, we work in essential oils, and so you need a fair amount of flour or biomass to be able to, have a small amount of essential oils. So that allows us to have an impact on many, many hundreds, if not thousands of acres. So that's one real, sort of way to look at it. The other thing to consider is there's an existing network of fair trade farmers all over the world. And their sad reality is that they actually don't sell all of their harvest as fair. So there's all of this sort of production out there that is just waiting to be purchased at a fair price with all of these ecological benefits. And the reality is it's just going into the conventional market where nobody has any idea whatsoever. So I think that's one aspect that could really, these are kind of like, low hanging fruit, not so heavy lifts that, companies can consider. But really, I think the big thing is that one, and the last sort of element that I think is critical here is really collaboration. We've certainly had to collaborate and lean on other partners in the industry to be able to scale out our work a little bit faster. So, for example, we sell to other third parties, both in Europe and the United States. To be able to support all of our projects on the ground. A supplier or a project or farmers, they rely on one buyer like Dr. Bronner's. That's really a very unstable relationship. So we want to make sure that they can sell everything under fair terms, but also, sell virtually everything that they have. And if we can find other buyers for that, that certainly helps out a lot. So, the nice thing in the industry is we're seeing more and more like pre-competitive collaboration in terms of sourcing. And that really allows us to leverage the work that we do. So I don't have to go and visit every supplier every year to say, hey, look, what's going on? What are the biggest challenges? How we can support you? We can actually share that amongst different companies. And I think that's one way to do it because, sometimes finances are tight and holy cow, it would be really difficult to visit all these suppliers. So those are my three recommendations. In terms of what consumers can do, I think it's been really difficult of late to try to navigate all of the different standards and certifications out there. Of course, where you can, having a direct relationship with farmers is really, really important. So that's like a first step. And in those examples where you can't really do it because let's say it's coffee and you don't live in the coffee lands, it's really looking for those standards and seals that really reflect your values. And so, I think the big thing here is to really continue to push retailers to highlight all of those products because without, sort of prominent placement and backing by retailers, it's really easy for a consumer to, pick something that maybe is a little bit cheaper, but maybe it doesn't reflect their values. So we've been really supporting retailers that have been highlighting organic, fair, and regenerative of late because we see them as really kind of the main driver here to be able to communicate more with consumers directly.
Now, you talked a lot about partnerships and collaboration. So how do you work to develop these types of partnerships with farms and other key stakeholders? And what are some examples?
Oh, wow. A lot of our projects, we've kind of come about through just serendipity. You have sort of, pre-existing relationships and, you want to focus on coconuts, for example, but how the heck do you actually do that is a different story. So I wish I had a magic wand to sort of like make this happen, quickly and without a whole lot of heartache. But my colleague and boss Gary Lazone actually wrote a great book that detailed all of our experiences in setting up these regenerative organic supply chains all over the world. The book is called Honor Thy Label, so I would say check that out. That's got a great lots of tidbits and kind of insofar as we got a recipe book for doing this, that would be a great place to start. But in large part, I think what we've done is really look for allies all across the landscape, whether that is technical support on the ground. We've had to learn a lot along the way. We certainly know how to make soap pretty well, but as we look to support brands and buyers that want like maybe medicinal plants like Gaia herbs, for example, or they want things like coconut milk for coconut milk smoothies or chocolate, what have you. We've had to really learn a lot. So it's been great to be able to engage buyers you learn so much just on kind of like things like quality, because those are some things that are often at times overlooked and really difficult to kind of scale up at speed. So I think it's really being open to, focusing on collaboration, and, being open to having visitors. I think one thing that really helps is when, people come to visit all of our projects. You learn so much because they see it with fresh eyes. So we just had Whole Foods visit our project in Ghana in February. It was great to be able to walk them through our entire process so they can learn, kind of how we do things, and then also get their feedback on kind of ideas and recommendations, how we might improve.
Has Dr. Bronner's experienced like an increase in customer support due to its genuine focus on creating socially and environmental sustainable supply chains? How is it being received by the people who purchase your products?
Yeah, I would say, it's really interesting. We've got a great team on our marketing team that really digs in and tries to understand what motivates consumers. And I would say that it's a pretty interesting mix. I'd say, every time you talk with consumer groups and do surveys, it's kind of a snapshot in time. So if the economy's not doing so well, they're focusing really on value, right? Dr. Bronner's is super concentrated. They want that high value product, which is great. I'm all for it. But there are others that really only want to buy things that are organic, fair trade, or regenerative. And so we're able to satisfy that sort of group as well. But to be perfectly honest with you, you've got kind of a very brief moment to be able to engage with consumers. And everybody's got different priorities. And so I certainly think having that sort of values behind the brand is really, really important. But ultimately, everybody kind of, has a different departure point. So we want to basically be able to provide sort of information that is relevant to them, whether it is like high value because of the concentration in the ingredients. That's great. Certainly the ethical buyers are another group. And then lastly, there are folks that probably have no idea that we're organic or fair trade, but like the fact that we have a 5-to-1 salary cap, for example, or all of our employees at our factories really enjoy living wages and great benefits. So there's different ways or different reasons why people love Dr. Bronner's. And it might be just because it's a great, product to take camping, or maybe because they love, doing the laundry and brushing their teeth with it as people have done in the past.
Why is it important for people and businesses to pay attention to how the things they buy are made?
Well, this I think is a really very important and timely question. So I was just at a trade show called Newtopia in Denver this week, and there was a huge collection of natural product brands from all that run the gamut, really, from all sorts of products. And so I think the big question is, I think, twofold from my perspective. One, I think consumers are much more savvy when it comes to understanding what goes into making a product. And as a result, companies need to be more transparent. We need to be more proactive when it comes to better sourcing. And we need to be able to sort of communicate that in a way that's not greenwashing. I think that's really challenging. There's lots of brands out there that are probably a little fast and loose with the facts. And so that's challenging for consumers to try to sort of wade through all of that misinformation. But nonetheless, it's really important to be able to be genuine, make progress, and really, I would say, do your best to sort of, source as clean ingredients as you can. And I think the other flip side, and I think the one that often goes maybe overlooked a little bit, is really, when you invest in relationships and, regenerative supply chains, wow, you are really doing your best to be able to prepare yourself, what I call like future proofing your supply chain, because the reality is it's a really brutal world out there for a lot of us that work in supply chain work. We have everything from climate chaos. COVID was a big catastrophe and an opportunity to learn. And then the world's a pretty unstable place. And so that makes it really difficult for farmers to be able to not only maintain the high standards that we expect, but also do that in a way that's consistent. It's impossible to make a product if you don't have any ingredients. So I see our approach by basically investing in these relationships for the long term really as a way to stabilize supply chains as best as possible. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. During COVID, the raw ingredient world was just all over the map. A lot of companies and a lot of farmers went out of business because they couldn't get their product to buyers, or the buyers couldn't purchase the product that they needed. And so we actually didn't have hardly any problems. We had a little bit of hiccups, but because we had sort of invested in our supply chains and our partners, we were able to support them through that process. So that really made a big difference. And then separately, you may be familiar with all of the different challenges on the climate front, but it's either, too hot, too cold, too much rain, not enough rain, all within the same year in some cases. And so this has led to this massive, massive disruptions. And one particular example that I think is really important is the case of cocoa. West Africa produces over 60% of the world's cocoa supply. But last year they had a season, unseasonably dry, and then all of a sudden, holy cow, you got way too much rain. And as a result, you saw just massive crop loss all across the board. And so while regenerative organic practices are not going to 100% buffer, the impacts of climate, our experience has been these practices make farms much more resilient in the face of climate catastrophe. And so we think that this is just an important way to support farmers and our own supply chains by investing in these practices.
What are some ways that everyday people can try to create a more social and environmentally sustainable world?
Oh wow, that is a great question. I think one of the sort of like easiest things is to vote with your dollars. As you purchase, whether it's a local farmers market, products at, let's say, your natural food store, and even I would say even some of the larger chains like Costco are buying more and more organic and fair trade. So I think there's more opportunities than ever to be able to really purchase products that reflect your values. I think that's like the first step. Important, not the only step, or I wouldn't say even the most important step, but ultimately we need to figure out a way to change the food system itself. And the only way we can do that is actually by voting for people that reflect our values, that really want to fundamentally transform the way we produce food, but not just food, but fiber, for example, and other products. And so there's, I think, two key ways to do this, or there's several ways, but one, obviously, as you vote for people, whether that's at the state level or at the federal level, that really sort of value, organic and fair trade, I think is really important. The other angle that I think is important is the Farm Bill, which is the process of which Congress goes through every 5 years to allocate funding and priorities. And this is a billion dollar bill that really has a big impact for not only the entire United States, but really the entire world. And so I think it's really important to engage on that. And if you really want to nerd out and get into the nitty gritty, there's the National Organic Standards process where you can talk specifically about organics. And that's one way to really get a little bit more involved in there. So I think it's a 1-2 punch of both consumer action, but also policy as well.
Are there any other things that you'd like to share?
I think, the great thing is, having been involved in this world for a while, when I first started in the late 90s, it was kind of, there wasn't a whole lot of avenues to get involved. I think now there are dozens, if not hundreds of ways to get involved, both within your own community, or even get involved internationally. And I think the key is not to fret about which is the best, but really just to start. And once you start, you can kind of go from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining the podcast today and for all the great work you're doing at Dr. Bronner's. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was great.